This little bed chamber, which is off of what had been the master bed chamber, to the casual modern visitor today, looks like it's in really, really rough shape. It hasn't been touched very much. Everything that you see in here, with the exception of the furnishings and the little bookshelf, are contemporary to that late 17th, early 18th century period. The whitewash has been added later, but the reason we stopped in here is because you can really see in the timber frame, the architectural layout of these houses. People often ask why they're still here, and although it's probably difficult to see on film, the post itself is angular. It flares up. A lot of people in New England started calling them gunstock corner posts at some point, but they do look like a gunstock. But in the day, the timber framers that created these posts, they're a two-story post, called them a jowl post. And the reason for the big flare has nothing to do with decoration. It's for joinery. There are actually 3 different joints on top of this post. This is a little summer beam that runs right past the chimney bay all the way to the front of the house, to the back of the house. This is the back plate. And this summer beam is sitting on top of a tenon called a teasel tenon, which runs fore and aft on the post itself. And the plate on the back, which is holding the rafters in the attic, and sits on top of another tenon called a back tenon, which runs side to side on the post. And then it's all tied together on top of this summer beam. There's a large dovetail that snaps down on top of all of this stuff. So this isn't going anywhere. All of these buildings, this building especially, has survived multiple catastrophic events weather-wise. Probably the most significant in our recorded history would have been Hurricane of '38, which devastated southeastern New England, and none of these buildings moved because of the way they were built. In the behind this little hanging closet, this would have been added in mid to latter part of the 19th century. It's a hanging closet simply because these are plank walls. It's plaster on both sides of a plank. There's no room for a closet. Prior to a hanging closet, they kept all their clothing in a trunk. But this is just nailed to the ceiling in the summer beam. Then there would have been a curtain around the perimeter to keep the dust and the sun off your clothes, and it's hung on pegs inside. But up inside the hanging closet, you can still see the original red paint from the late 1600s. It's still on the summer beam, which is very unusual. The Wing family, when I first came here some 30 plus years ago, were just in the process of restoring this room, and I begged them to leave it alone because this, as it sits today, is very rare. It's virtually untouched. Even some of the original paint is still on the floor off to the side, so it's not worn from people's trafficking on it. This today is set up as a Victorian parlor. We're actually upstairs. By the Victorian period, most of these parlors were downstairs. This particular parlor happened to belong to Cora Wing, and I think it was passed to her by her mother. So it is part of the Spring Hill Wing family, but it wouldn't have been upstairs in its heyday. It was probably down in the courtroom. This particular room, in its heyday, was the master bed chamber. How do we know that? Well, there's several things that tell us that. There are 3 fireplaces up here, all of them modestly decorated around the firebox. This one, this mantle that you see today is added well into the 19th century. It would have been a full open, big raised panel. The fireplace was bricked in to accommodate a coal stove, but this big collection molding is very high-end, fancy stuff from the Georgian period, the 1760s. And this speaks of the way it's all surrounded again by very elaborate, fancy moldings. It was originally painted blue and black. Really, really just kind of wow when you walk in. And the other thing that tells us that it was the master bedchamber is a secret that lies under this matting. This matting would have been contemporary to the Victorian period. You see references of people laying it on floors, generally in the late fall, to keep floors warmer, houses warmer. It's sisal, it's a straw carpet. You can still purchase it today. You see women bringing it to the beach to roll out and lie on. A lot of it comes out of the Eastern Bloc and parts of Asia, but it's very inexpensive, cheaper than paint, easier to lay down. This happens to just be packed to the floor. But several years ago, in my exploration of the house, I wanted to see what was going on under the mat. So I started yanking some of it up. I'm really not a big fan of the Victorian period anyway. But what I found, I'll try to help my camera woman by not getting in her way. I'll back up so she can get a closer look. But you'll see the floor is painted in a floral pattern. It's kind of a slate gray underneath is a base color. And then kind of a darker blue. It looks like flowers and leaves and things like that on top of that. And what that is doing is mimicking, if you pull this back further, you can see right here, hopefully the president's here watching this, you can see a line of delineation right there. And that line is where a carpet didn't meet the wall. Woolen carpets were available in the pre-revolutionary period, again, for the very wealthy. We know Joshua Wing was doing very well by what he did with the interior of the house with this kind of finish work, and by some of the material culture, his garbage that we found in the yard. But he had enough money to import an English woolen carpet. England's Industrial Revolution started 100 years before ours in the 1730s, and by Joshua's time in the 1760s, those that were very well-to-do, the big planters and things, started importing these machine woven carpets out of England. They would have been woven in mills that were most often water-powered over there. Some of them, or the majority of them, are room size, different sizes. They weighed a lot. Some of the bigger carpets actually was the weft of the warp was actually wire to hold the weight of the carpet because of their weight. But we know Joshua Wing had the money to bring carpeting to his master bedchamber, and where it didn't meet the wall, he again had money to hire a faux painter with the ability and the skills to replicate the pattern of that carpet to meet the wall where it didn't meet. So we know there was a carpet in here, and we know roughly what the pattern and the colors were, which is kind of, again, unusual that that stuff didn't get scraped away. But the whole floor in the middle of the room to this day under this matting is still bare. There's no paint on it whatsoever. So this would have been, in his day, an extraordinary room, probably furnished with, if he had that kind of carpet in here, you have to guess there was White furniture and that kind of thing up here. And Joshua Wing had the money to be comfortable, and he made sure it was comfortable. We have several photographs of people on the front wall of this so-called Victorian parlor. And these are 19th century photographs of people that lived here at Spring Hill. This guy lived in the house. That's one of the Joshua's. And a lot of people comment, well, he looked pretty rugged, they're not smiling, well, unhappy, blah, blah, blah. Part of it, there's two different things going on here. The eclipse between, the snapping of the shutter and then the making of the photograph is nothing like it is today. It's not click, it's click and wait and move, wait and move, wait and move. That's part of what's going on. But secondly, if you look closely at this guy, it might be hard to see on film, but his lower mandible, look at his lower lip, it looks like he's got a roll of chewing tobacco under his tongue, but he doesn't. He has gingivitis, and gingivitis, and she's getting it, is horrendously debilitating. It's still out there today, but not to the degree that it was back then. Dental hygiene, in a lot of cases, until well into the 19th century, was non-extant. So people's teeth rotted, and there were all kinds of dental ailments. Teeth are pulled, generally by folk healers or barber surgeons. But he's got it to the point where he's got severe swelling. But one of the benefits this man happens to have, this wing fellow, is by this time, this is probably, by the looks of the clothing and stuff, maybe the 1860s, there's opiates everywhere. And I do historic archaeology, have for over 40 years, and all of these sites, one of the most common artifacts we found either whole or broken are opiate bottles. And you could go to the local apothecary, the local general store, if you have an ailment. You could buy a pure opiate in a tiny little bottle, something like that. You'd put a drop of that on the tip of your finger and suck it off. And you'd be high as a kite for probably a couple hours, and that pain is gone. You're whistling, walking behind the plow, all that kind of stuff, and it was a miracle drug. And any of you that have collected old bottles and the like have most likely seen the old bottles that say, Dr. So-and-so's elixir cures all pain and blah, blah, blah. And it's the same stuff. They might mix it with sarsaparilla or some other junk, but it's pure opiates. In the 1840s, one of the things that started the big suffrage movement in the 1840s was alcohol addiction and drug addiction. Opium was available in all manner of forms. You could smoke it, you could drink it. I think it came in a powder form. But it was available to everyone. We've even found opiate pipes that are coming directly out of China. The bowls are about the size of a pencil eraser. They're often effigy bowls, like a goat's head or something like that, made out of clay. And they're smoking pure opium. It was much like happening today. We have a severe opiate problem across the nation, if not across the world. And it's not the first time. It's happened before. There were a lot of people in the 1840s. Domestic abuse went through the ceiling. Guys were losing their jobs, losing their farms, and all because of opiate addiction. The guy that whom I always forget his name, that wrote Sherlock Holmes, Lord, whatever his name is, Tennyson or whatever it was, he even at one point puts Sherlock Holmes, Watson has to go find him. He's in an opiate den in London because it even affected, class didn't matter. It was just like today, right across the board, class, race, nothing. It didn't discern. So it's not, everything that seems new is generally old. If it's happening now, it probably happened before, which doesn't make it any better, but it is new. This is the best parlor. This is a huge statement room for Joshua Wing. The paneling in here, the furnishings, it would have been where they kept their finest plate, their finest furniture. This is by far the least used room in this house. Both of these parlor doors would have been closed always, again, to keep them clean. The only time you're going to pass through this door, from the front door into this room, is if you are someone that Joshua wants to duly impress. Joshua Wing was the owner, the master of this house in that pre-revolutionary period. These are the original paint colors that were reproduced. They do this polychrome so that everything in here pops. If you look closely, there's even two different browns. There's a dark chocolate and milk chocolate. If you can imagine, if this was all painted, say brown or blue, everything melds together. Joshua Wing paid a finish carpenter a lot of money to create this. This is all done with hand planes. It's custom designed for the house and its owner, the Bluction Molding. Just to make this molding alone, the finish carpenter is going to be using probably anywhere from 3 to 5 different little hand planes to create that molding profile. And that finish carpenter is buying those planes from a plane maker. And like today, good tools are very expensive, and he's going to pass that cost on to you. So this room is huge about statement. Joshua might have someone in here to settle accounts, which is usually happening in the wintertime when the fields are fallow, there's not a lot going on. He owes people money, people owe him money. They come and they settle accounts. They might have a meal. They might have some Madeira or some sherry. Sherry was very popular as well. But you're a person of note when you're brought into this room. Most of the people that are brought into the house would have been brought into that second parlor, which sometimes I wonder if you thought you were somebody and you came here and Joshua brought you into that first parlor or the second parlor, you're like, oh God, I thought I was somebody, but you're going to be somebody that they really want to impress. The other things that may have happened in here is a wedding or some very special occasion, but again, open only to a very prominent visitor. Even the stone in front of the hearth here. Again, this is a very expensive item. This is dressed, and you got to remember, these aren't water saws. This stone is a statement as much as all this stuff is. This, the quarrymen, when they're cutting this stone, this is a local pink granite that's coming out of Falmouth, and the quarrymen, when you order something like this and they're cutting it out of the quarry, they're going to dress it while it's green, as they would call it. Green meaning it's still full of water. You got to remember this stuff is under the ground. There's water passing through it down into the aquifer. Granite's very porous. If they tried to cut this stone like this after it was dry, then it happened. You can look very closely at the surface of the stone. Years ago, in my boredom and psychosis, I laid out a little, I think it was a 2-inch square piece of paper, you know, with the open in the middle. And I counted, it might be hard to see on film, but there's hundreds and hundreds of little tiny relief cuts going across the face of the stone. And what's happening there is, again, while the stone's still green, there's a stone mason, a quarryman, taking a cold chisel, and he's cutting these little relief marks through all the way across the stone by the thousands. And it would have looked like a miniature washboard all the way across the stone. After he's done with that, then he takes a larger, wider face chisel, and he starts knocking all those little mounds off until he gets it to this point, and then they just start throwing an aggregate on it, usually a mid-grade granular sand, and then they just start rubbing it with a bigger, flatter stone until they finish it to this point. So it's a lot of work, and even cutting the shape of the stone. The floor would have been painted, probably, if not carpeted. There's no evidence of a carpet, so we're not interpreting it. But we do know that there was some kind of paint in here, because here and there in the floor where they, when they were sanding it, they didn't get all the paint, so it was some kind of a green color. There's a very elaborate, again, very expensive, built-in corner cupboard. And again, this is for all their high-end plate to be stored in. When you're serving people in this room, you're gonna, again, you're impressing them. You're gonna pull out your finest plate and cutlery, and they'd be served any food that they were gonna consume in here. There'd be little bottles of sherry and Madeira usually in here, maybe wine. And often they're decanted in these decanters. This one happens to be an earlier one. But again, it's all about class and just impressing people. And you can see how this is a really elaborate little decanter. Sherry was huge. Everybody talked about it, right from Franklin on, even Adams. Madeira is another one that was very popular. Beer was common. That's what everyone drank at every meal, even the children. So if you were going to impress and really want to have a good time, people like to, what's the term you would use? Put a smile on your face since, you know, we learned how to stand upright. And they did it all the time. They talked about it. People traveling, especially in the winter months, that's when people visit. And that's when parties are had and things like that. But I've seen multiple accounts of people talking about in their diaries traveling. One of my favorite passages was from a guy here in town that talks about it's in the winter and going to a friend's house to drink sherry and eat oysters, and he ends up spending the night. He doesn't say so, but sometimes even riding a horse after you've had a few too many isn't always a good idea, but he doesn't make it back till the next morning. But I can't accuse him of something I don't know. That's what I would have done. But, so that's the best parlor. So this is the keeping room, the kitchen, the hall. They had multiple terms. Kitchen and hall. Hall's popular in the 17th and 18th century, but I have seen kitchen referenced as early as the 17th century as well. So whatever you feel comfortable with is what it was. But it's where the family pretty much lived when they were inside, unless they were sleeping. There's a large hearth for cooking food with a very large beehive oven next to it. It's kind of rough to see because this door doesn't open as wide as it used to. But behind this pot is a very large beehive oven. It's used for baking pies, breads, all manner of things. This happens to be a pudding pot. You can see in this original one, the exterior is all kind of burned and charred, and it's glazed on the interior. But puddings of all types of sorts were very, very popular. There's smaller pots. I think this is pretty much the largest one. I can't recall seeing one bigger. But they generally don't have a cover. If they were going to cover them for one reason or other, they probably would have just used a board, because these ovens don't have large fires in them. The fire is built inside the oven prior to baking by a few hours maybe. After the fire burns down, all the coals are pushed to the parameter of the oven, and then the things that are going to bake are put in the center part of it, and there would have been an iron door that closed it off here, and you close this door, and that would keep the heat in the oven. But these ovens got pretty hot, and they'd retain the heat because it's 2 layers of brick that are plastered over on the exterior so that they would hold the radiant heat. You could bake for several hours in those ovens. And all the fuel, the fire is stowed in the area beneath. That's not an actual fire pit. Above it is where another cupboard had been that they took out so that you could see the construction of the chimney mass. In this case, it's the shell mortar, lime mortar, and clay, all from different periods. The bricks represent builds from the 17th and 18th century, but it's just to allow you to see how everything's put together. But the clay itself that's used to lay up the chimney mass is actually dug out of the marsh itself like that. And it's kind of interesting because you can see bits of when they changed these houses. All the stuff that's being moved around, if it's still structurally stable, they don't throw it out. And for my camera woman, it's kind of hard to see, but if you look at this little timber, it's a nailer for the paneled wall. But if you look very closely on this edge, you can see a little profile. You can see it curves, and then there's another half round, and then it's flat over here, and it's flat down here. I can't see my own hand. I'm getting tossed and turned, but it's flat on the top and the bottom and the back. And what's really cool is what we're looking at is the header from one of those little diamond pane windows. When they took all the old windows out of this house to put in the big Georgian lights that we have today, they dismantled those windows. They would have saved all the lead that held the glass together to make shot and stuff for their weapons. And then any of the wood, like this piece, was still structurally solid. And whoever was around, the finished carpenters or whatever, said, hey, don't throw that out. I can use that inside the wall for a nailer. So that's what they do. And I've documented almost every inch of this house over the last 30-some years. And we found used, reused stuff all through the house, all around the chimney mass, up inside the walls. Inside the wall, as you're climbing the chimney, you can go under that front staircase, and you can climb the chimney mass all the way to the attic. And like we were talking about upstairs, the interior walls of this house are just plank walls. They're planks that are laid to divide the rooms, that plastered on either side. Around the chimney bay, they're just plastered on one side, the side that faces the interior of the house, the chamber it represents. But up inside the chimney mass, one of those boards that's making up one of the walls in one of the rooms up there, on the inside, in the chimney bay, it's a floorboard from one of the earlier barns that they have when they take down. They save the boards, and they used it in the 16 or 1700s to make a wall upstairs in the house, and they didn't clean the board off. There's a big cow turd with hay on it and everything still stuck to the board, and it's got a cow track in it, and it's the most unusual, coolest kind of thing I ever saw in my life. But it's like, wow, there's a big cow pie up here with a cow track still in it from the colonial period. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff in here, which is kind of fun. There's not that many right here, but all the walls and ceilings are all full of corn cobs, in a lot of cases bones, funnels, and the corn cobs represent a big part of the house's history. All the corn that they're growing isn't like the stuff we grow today. It's not eaten off the cob. It's called flint corn, and that corn is dried generally on the stalk. After it dries, it comes in the house. It's put in bushel baskets generally, and that's stored in the attic. You can't just show up at the miller's with your grain to be ground. You got to get all those kernels off the cobs, and then you bag up the kernels and bring them to the miller, and he grinds it into meal for you at some point, but you have to wait your turn. So all that stuff's sitting in the house, and when that comes in the house, the animals that were out in the fields feeding on it come with it. So these houses, and again, multiple times in diaries and things I've seen in primary source material, people talking about the houses becoming alive at night. Some points to the case where one woman is complaining she can barely sleep with all the running and gnawing and the walls and ceilings. And when those animals, rats and squirrels or whatever's up there, comes into the house, they grab the corn out of the basket in the attic, and they want to go hide from their friends with it, so they drag it into a ceiling or a wall, and they sit there and gnaw on it until somebody else finds them. But so there's literally thousands of cleaned corn cobs in the ceilings and walls, and it's not insulation, it's rodents that have brought it there. In some cases, bones, all the garbage, everything that these people produce, they're not taking it to the dump. They're not, in most cases, unless you're in an urban area, they dug trash pits. But in these farm settings, the women are just walking to the back door or the window or wherever they are and just chucking it out into the yard. Food waste, all that kind of broken pottery, everything, and that is what myself and others as historic archaeologists eventually go to look for. We root through colonial garbage, as we can learn a lot about what happened here by what they've left behind. This is a little back shed. The Wing family refers to it as the summer kitchen. It may or may well have not been used for that or had been used for it. I don't know. They're free to call it what they'd like to, but it's an early building. The frame is early, I think first period, probably before 1720. A lot of these sheds, these outbuildings, are in the yard. This particular building didn't get attached to the main body of the house until well into the 19th century, probably after the Civil War. It was brought here from the other end of Spring Hill Road, so goes the oral history. But in this particular case, like up in the attic, you can see behind the plaster that was broken, there's another little diamond case window that's been boarded in. If you look very closely, you see two different lath types. This is very elegant, early lath. And it's all hand ribbon, split out with froze and mallets. This stuff is a lot heavier, kind of criminally done. It's just not, they didn't really know what they were doing. And then even the plaster job is kind of whoever did it was a hack. But there was a little diamond pane window in here. The frame itself is all white oak. Some of it's a little bit compromised. It had a loft above it, a half loft. You can see where a timber let into the tie beams on either side. And if you look up in the gable in the shadows, again, you can see those two boards are holding in a little door that used to open and close. And I think it was some sort of shop at one point in its life. If you look on the walls, and these are all held on with wrought nails, but there's little chisel rests. They're all different size little slots cut for some of these chisels that were sitting up here. So I think it was some sort of work building. That doorway is the original in and out door. It's covered with a contemporary screen door. But again, this is a very, very early batten door, which we're going to reproduce at some point and take it out of the building and bring it inside so we do not lose it forever. It's probably over 300 years old, and we're going to exhibit it in a safer place than leaving it exposed to the weather. But it's got all kinds of stories behind it. It's been reset with different types of hardware several times in its history, but that is the original out passageway to this early little building. And then the wings may have used it as an outbuilding in the 19th century. All the families are slaughtering their own meat supply for the winter. It's generally hogs and calves. The whole family would be involved. The animals are slaughtered. Hogs are scraped, scalded and scraped. So they generally at slaughtering time, the entire family is involved. They're generally slaughtering hogs and calves to put by for their winter meat supply. Early on in the colonial period and well into the 19th century, the majority of the meat is salted or pickled. The hams and the bacons are gotten out, and those are usually smoked. All the other bits and pieces are either consumed immediately, beef's tongue, things like that, are consumed right away as a fresh food source. They used absolutely every part of the animal. You even find on these historic sites, archaeologically, you find sawn and cleaved skulls of hogs and calves where they're using the brains and the tongues, in a lot of cases the eyes. Lights, as they refer to them, they were considered a delicacy, and as they when they're cooking these pieces, when it's cooked and it comes out of the pot, or if it's roasted, they even smash the bones open and they consume the marrow. Marrow's considered a delicacy as well. The very wealthy actually had marrow spoons, which were a long, elongated tubular spoon, so you could scoop the marrow out of the bone, but most people picked it out with a knife. So a little shed like this could have been used for that, something like that, because that's a lot of heavy work, especially salting. It's not something you generally want to drag into your kitchen and do. People will often talk, if they didn't have a building to do it in, they're doing it in the dooryards. There are even photographs from the 19th century, even into the early 20th century, of people slaughtering animals in the dooryard, which is usually the back or the side yard. There's a big kettle in the corner of this little shed. And that's a rendering kettle. That would have been outside, either hanging on a tripod or up on stones with a very large fire beneath it, and all the waste, all the fat from the animals is pitched in there, and it's rendered into tallow. And that tallow is later used for making candles in some cases, soap in others, even greasing machinery and wagon axles, stuff like that. There's evidence of people using tallow to waterproof their boots. So again, every part of the animal is used. The hides are generally tanned by the local tanner. Sometimes they sell the raw hides outright to the tanner, or they have them tanned for their own use, but most of them just sell the hide to the tanner outright. When the tanner gets those hides, with the exception of hogs, because those you're going to use that skin as part of the meat source, but the cow hides, horse hides, stuff like that, the tanner is going to take that hide. The first thing he's going to do is scrape the hair off, and he's going to set that aside because he sells that to the masons, the plasterers. They're going to use that hair to mix in with their plaster as a binder. The other thing they do is they flip that hide over, and there's a very very thin plane of tissue on the back side of that hide that's like the thickness of cellophane, and that is what separates the hide from the muscle in the animal. But they scrape that tissue off, and they set it aside, and they dry it out, and then it gets kind of ground into flakes, and they put that aside, and they sell that to the joiners, people like Samuel Wing. When they're making furniture and stuff, they take that dried tissue from the back side of the hide, and they know roughly what they need, and they take a little warm water and mix it with that tissue. It turns kind of yellow when it dries, and they make glue, and it was called, and still is, you can still buy actual hide glue for the real hardcore reproduction. People still use hide glue. So again, there's no part of the animal that's thrown away. Everything is used to one degree or the other. So it could well be what the Wings were using this building for, is that kind of activity, is butchering and maybe later on canning and stuff. So what you're looking at here is the earliest root cellar under the house. There are actually two of them. There's a fairly moderner one from the 1700s under the east end of the back of the house, and this one is from the late 17th or very early 18th century. It's partially silted in, but this is the root cellar that belonged to that salt box that we showed you the drawing of in the beginning of the tour, and it's where they would have stored for the winter months all of their squashes, pumpkins, in some cases hard apples and pears, pickled things in storage jars, pickled meats and things like that. Because it's subterranean, it's under the ground, it won't freeze. They did have to constantly battle with vermin, trying to keep them out of there. All of these farms had cats. They weren't pets. They weren't treated as such. They were work animals. Cats were not fed. They didn't sit on your lap. You didn't play with them. You certainly didn't give them a ball of yarn. If you feed a cat, why is it going to chase a rat? So they were just treated like another animal on the farm. They were livestock, and they depended on those cats to keep down the vermin. And I found cat skeletons all over the place under these houses. Often when their time comes, like any animal, if they know they're on their way out, they're going to go find someplace quiet to expire. And in the cases of cats, they often know how to get under the house, and they certainly spend an inordinate amount of time under there chasing vermin. They're the perfect place to go to die, and we find evidence of them all the time. This is an inside outhouse. This particular outhouse dates to probably sometime soon after the Civil War. It's rather elaborate. It's even got its own Victorian wallpaper, which is original. It's a three-seater. Is unlike today, going to the bathroom is a very private matter, and unless you're in the train station at New York City or something like that. But in the colonial period and much later on, even into the post-Second World War period, bathing and bathing wasn't something to, bathing and going to the bathroom wasn't something that you needed to be ashamed of or hide about. And people did it together. As you can see, there's a three-seater here. There's a smaller one on the end for children, but people just sat on the pot together, and there are a lot of good conversations had in many of these. Prior to built-in outhouses, most of the privies are on skids, and there can be two-seaters, three-seaters, but they would dig a pit in the property around the house. They'd have an oxen drag the outhouse over the pit. Once that pit was filled, they'd redig another one, backfill the old pit, and it went on and on and on. In the case of this particular outhouse, we have a copy of Sears and Roebuck. This was a magazine that everybody, or catalog everyone was very familiar with until fairly recently. And was it the late 19th century when they first started coming out? People talked about it being the best toilet paper in the world. Everyone has served two purposes. While you're in here doing your business, you had something to read if you didn't have someone to talk to, and secondly, you use the pages of the part you were least interested in to take care of business when you were done. My grandparents talked about how wonderful Sears and Roebuck, and they were known for their catalogs having the best paper for the outhouse. Prior to Sears and Roebuck, they were using hay, corn husks, in some cases corn cobs. That was what you were using to clean yourselves with after the affair. But things were very different than what we would be comfortable with today. There's one of my favorite passages from a diary from the late 19th century. Was all it said for this particular day was visited with Clara in the expletive house today, and that's all she had to say about that particular day. But it kind of made you laugh that people, they had, like I said, conversations. It was some place to visit, like kind of going to a coffee shop. Only instead of drinking coffee, you were expelling it.